Hi everyone. First, I would like to thank the iFHC for inviting me to be here with you and to talk to you about the situation in Egypt. I'd like to thank Sergio and the rest of the people working on the iFHC for their hospitality and their friendly atmosphere. I'll talk today about the situation in Egypt, and I believe the title of the lecture or the talk is about the possible future of democracy, or does democracy have a chance in Egypt or not? And in broad terms, I believe the answer is no and yes. Well, I believe in very general terms, it doesn't have a prospect right now, but possibly it will have prospect for future for democracy in the long-term future. Let me first elaborate the key themes of my talk, and I will use the narrational technique, like telling a story or narrating the story of. I don't know if you are familiar with the or have much background in Egyptian politics, so I'll try to tell the story in some kind of historical perspective. But I'll first need to elaborate the key themes of my talk. I have kind of 4 or 5 main themes or main points. The first point is that the problem in Egypt is not the problem of democratic transition. With all respect to our transitologist friends, Guillermo O'Donnell or Philip Schmitter or others who talk about, democracy breakthrough, consolidation, transformation, consolidation, etc., etc. Problem in Egypt is much deeper than that. And actually, one of the issues in Egypt is that as long as you deal with the problem as if it's a problem of democratic transition, then you cannot really provide solutions. Problem in Egypt is the need to create a new polity. And when I say new polity, I mean an entirely new state, entirely new political system, entirely new state with new social contracts, new political contract and new economic contract. This is the crisis in Egypt. The old polity is a failure, and its failure is exposed. And the problem is that the strongest actors in society are either unwilling to recognize this or want to resist this. And that's one of the problems. And the forces which recognize this are too weak and too impotent to impose or to intervene in order to create this badly needed new polity. That's the first theme. The second theme, the Egyptian revolution, which I believe is the most fundamental case in the Arab revolutions, not because I'm Egyptian, but from a scientific point of view, because it's really very fundamental and engage with the key issues in politics among the different 6 cases of the Arab Spring revolutions. The Egyptian revolution is not a classical revolution. I mean, it's not like a classical revolution. For example, I'm thinking here in terms of the Russian Revolution or the Iranian revolution of the 20th century, in which there is a regime crisis and then a clear political and economic bankruptcy, regime collapse, and then we have a clear organized political opposition movement with a clear ideology and a clear vision of how to rule, and then comes to power and impose its view and create a new system. No, that's not the case in Egypt. The case in Egypt is the case of the exposition of failure. The revolution, it exposed the failure, the bankruptcy, the outdated of the old system, and we're still in the political vacuum. The old system is exposed to be failure, but it's still there simply because out of momentum, because no one is capable of replace it or come in its place with new vision or with new solutions. And as I said, the new forces are unable to remove the old forces. So that's the second theme. The third theme, the key actors in our story. We have 5 key actors in the Egyptian political situation. We have the old state, probably the most important actor, and I'll explain what do I mean by the old state later. We have the Islamist movement. Most important is the Muslim Brotherhood movement. We have the we have the business class, or the bourgeoisie class, and the business, as I said, the business class. We have the democratic forces, that's number 4, and then we have the common people, that's the number 5. And the common people are distributed among different categories, and we'll explain this in more details later. That's the second theme, identifying the key actors here. The third theme, what's going on in Egypt right now after the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood President Mohammed Morsi by military coup, popularly backed military coup, supported military coup on July 3rd. I believe what's going on in Egypt right now is a Bonapartism in the classical sense, in political science. It's a Bonapartism in the making, and I believe it has a popular backing, and it has clearly obvious fascist intentions, but I believe they lack the resources necessary to make a successful Bonapartism, and I'm not sure. I think that that it's unlikely that it will succeed in establishing itself in a successful way in the coming future. The final point is that I believe what's going on in Egypt, especially when this Bonapartism comes to a failure, is a political limbo, vacuum, the non-existence, as I said, the failure of the old forces and the inability of the new forces, if there are any new forces, to replace the old one. And this reminds us of saying by Antonio Gramsci when he talks about the old and the new. The old is dead but is not left yet, and the new is not born yet. And I think that's the situation in Egypt, more or less. Okay, so let's start explaining the different themes I have been summed up at the beginning. As I said, the key actors, the old states and the Islams. The old state. What do I mean with the old state in Egypt? Well, it's a very controversial term. When I say the old state, actually I mean the modern state. But I'm saying it's old state because it became expired and kind of outdated. And the modern state in Egypt, it was built on different stages since the early 19th century, especially the founder of modern state in Egypt, Muhammad Ali. But the current state that we have right now in Egypt was established, its main features were established by President Gamal Abdel Nasser in the 1950s and 60s in Egypt. In very broad terms, this state has three different characteristics, structural characteristics. The first one is authoritarianism. The second one is guardianship. The third one is violence, structure of violence. Authoritarianism, this state was clearly authoritarian. Authoritarian in the sense of what? No politique. Politics are, people are not allowed to represent themselves politically. Rights of organization were denied. Even if they were there in constitutions, it was just nominal rights. But effectively, they were very much restricted and controlled. There is this state which is very elitist. That's one of the features of this state, elitism. And mainly it's controlled by the military elites, bureaucratic elite, police elites, ruling the state and deciding the outcomes of the political process. So basically the idea of politics as a sphere for people, different social groups to represent themselves, to organize, to express themselves, to compete for power, or to negotiate on behalf of their own interests or behalf of their own worldview, that was not allowed. Okay, it's only one national interest defined by the state, and it's a kind of neo-corporatist system created in which there is the state and everyone else is the client of this state. So it's through a complicated system of patronage and clientelism, which has been there in place using a lot of laws, constitution, political mechanisms, economic mechanisms, and so on. Okay, it's not corporatism in the classical sense like in Latin America or Spain or Portugal. It's more of a neo-corporatism, because in corporatism you have like a state and dealing with different entities, like for example peasant groups or unions or church or others. But in the case of Egypt, it's a neo-corporatist model in which the state incorporates all other groups. No group is allowed to organize outside the state guardianship or outside the state control. That was the case under Abdel Nasser, and it remains so up till nowadays, up till this very second. I mean, in terms of laws and the law and the institutions and the actual politics in Egypt. So it's, as I said, it's elitist. It's based on it's authoritarian, elitist, guardianship, and it's also violent, because the state here discourage pluralism. So minorities are not represented, are not to be allowed, and so there's some kind of symbolic violence and actual violence against political opponents, against women, and against religious and ethnic minorities. There are not many of them in Egypt, but still the religious minority is important, the Christian minority, and other sectarian minorities as well. But problem with this state in Egypt, it's obviously undemocratic, but it was also non-developmental. We have many cases worldwide of undemocratic states that were successful economically in terms of economic development. The most important and staggering example, of course, are Southeast Asian. The Asian tigers and their famous examples for economic development under of strong authoritarian leaderships. South Korea, Singapore, and others. Okay, but in the case of Egypt, you have an undemocratic state and it was also non-developmental. It simply failed to make economic development. It tried different economic strategies. They have tried the ISI, they have tried the EOI, they have tried using public sector, private sector, foreign aid, different sorts of policies, and more or less all of them failed in generating wealth, in creating production. The perennial economic problem in Egypt is the lack of labor intense in investment, whether from public sector or private sector, in labor intensive industrial goods and services. That's a perennial economic problem in Egypt and has been lacking since Abdel Nasser up till now. So simply you don't generate wealth, you don't create employment opportunities, and you depend mainly on rent. Whether domestic economic rents like tourism, like construction, real estate, or political or remittances from Egyptians working in the Gulf, or political rent, foreign aid, which comes mostly imported from the Gulf countries, and before the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and now after that the US aid. That's political rent and economic rent. So it's a kind of a rentier economy, okay, but a limited one. And as I said, no development, no wealth generation, no employment opportunities, no prospect for economic development. Add to this a drastic deterioration in the quality of basic services and needs, especially under Mubarak. Mubarak stayed in power for 30 years. That's very long period. Under Mubarak, the quality of the basic service in Egypt extremely underdeveloped. Mainly the education, healthcare, basic services and needs, water, electricity, sanitation, all sorts of basic services and needs became extremely underdeveloped, very low quality. Even law enforcement, it deteriorated. The state-society relations became extremely inefficient. And actually, if you look at the indices of Egypt in the Human Development Report 2010, you'll find them among the very lowest. It's only comparable to sub-Saharan African countries, which I think it's among the lowest categories in terms of worldwide, in terms of development. But more important than that, under Mubarak, something else happened, which was not the case under Abdel Nasser or even under Sadat. It's the creation of what I termed Taifa state. That's a term I coined, and I hope that this term might be popular after that. Taifa, that's an Arabic word, which means, or Ta'ifa, which means a sect. Okay, I'm basically saying that the Egyptian state is becoming not really a state, but a group of different states, or group of different state fiefdoms within the state. It's as if it's divided into different islands. Each island, it's different oligarchy, different oligopolies. Each island has its own world. So for example, the military, the intelligence service, the police, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the religious institutions, the business class. Each one of them has its own economic interests, its own laws, its own rules, its own mechanisms of promotion and criteria, and its own system of distributing benefits. And to make it worse, all of them engage in economic activities under Mubarak. Mostly important here is the military, of course. Under Mubarak, the military was allowed to create a real economic empire. Absolutely strong, humongous economic empire, which is non-taxable, of course, and they enjoy the free, unpaid labor, the conscripts, and it's not subject to any kind of state oversight. And they also enjoy monopoly rights over public lands and energy and other sources. So each estate or each fiefdom has its own place and its own rules, and none of them has intervenes into the affairs of the other one. Okay, and the public policy, the government public policy is the result of the compromise and the bargaining between these different fiefdoms or these different states. Okay, so this is very dangerous because practically it impedes any prospect for political reform or democratization or economic reform, because there is not a single political institution capable of enforcing concessions on the rest of the institutions. Okay, because everyone is engaged in this game of distributing spoils and benefits among their own clientele. And the basic rule of the game is don't intervene with my own territory, with my own borders, with my own influence and with own men and so on. Okay? So that's really a Mubarak phenomenal thing. And with Mubarak, the problems of the old state, they intensified. Two main crises here, which were totally responsible for the eruption of the revolution: crisis of legitimacy, crisis of performance or achievement. Crisis of legitimacy, simply the state is not representative of wide segments of the population. They're simply not there. As I said, remember the old state under Mubarak, elitist, guardian, authoritarian, so it's not representative of the population. Okay, over time under Mubarak it became even worse with the taifas state thing. So wide segments of the population are simply not there in the state, not there in the public policy making. This includes the informal sector, this includes the private sector, especially the lower income private sector, this includes the agrarian sector and the youth groups and others. And of course the urban lumpen proletariat and these groups are completely not present in the political sphere, and these, I would argue, represent the majority of the population in Egypt if we put them in numbers. That's the first crisis. The second crisis is the crisis of achievement, crisis which simply no achievement in Egypt. Like people would have accepted all of that if there is some kind of achievement. As I said, economically there is no achievement, and there is no economic development growth. Even the economic growth that was achieved under Mubarak was very deceptive. It was based on, as I said, aid and flow of aid, and it was not really based on real production. And as I said, under Mubarak, the quality of law enforcement in the most conservative definition was not there. Quality of basic services were not there, etc., etc. So as I said, crisis of legitimacy and crisis of achievements. And the police was also important. The police is very brutal in Egypt. And under Mubarak in specific, because Mubarak killed the political sphere even more, so there were political parties, but they only exist on paper. Okay, so there was no real election, no real competition. So there's no politics in Egypt. The existing political party was not a real party. It was a forum for patronage and clientelism, nothing more than that. So the only institution in society which was responsible for managing the people's social affairs and managing people's affairs was the police. So the police acted as if it's the government arm or the governmental institution in the eyes of the people. That's why the common people in Egypt, when they refer to the police, they don't say police or shorta or any other terms which denote police in Egypt. They say hukuma, which means government. So that's the face of government that they are familiar with in Egypt. And the Egyptian police, it's not accountable like any other state institution, very corrupt, very brutal, and so it stirred the anger and the wrath of the population. Someone might ask, if this is the case, then why the revolution was so late? I believe, yes, it could have erupted much earlier, but there are some objective reasons behind that. Well, I believe that after the defeat in 1967, the Nasser state lost its legitimacy in terms of achievements, okay? But the Egyptian state, the old state, it remained in power mainly because of the need for the requirements of war with Israel, which took up between 1967 till 1973. Then the requirements of making peace with Israel, which took up the period between 1973 till 1982. Then the requirements of fighting the specter of the radical Islamist groups, terrorism or violence, which was a clear nightmare in Egypt, which took over most of the Mubarak period between early 1980s till 2000. When the danger of the Islamic violence or terrorism subsided by 2000, political protests started to emerge and to take momentum. And actually the revolution in 2011 was the cumulative outcome of a decade of protests, which started as early as 2000, to be precise, 2004. And a lot of protest activities, demonstrations, strikes, sit-ins, and the role of the youth movements in the social media, etc., etc. So that's the old state. We'll come back to the problematics of the old state when we talk about the Bonapartism and its problems in Egypt. Now the Islams. And the most important Islamist movement, if the hardcore of the old state is the military, which is true. Remember the Taifa state, the strongest Taifa or the strongest institution is the military. The hardcore of the Islamist groups is the Muslim Brotherhood. Although it's not the most populous, like the Salafists, for example, it's another Islamist movement. They have even larger numbers of people and followers than the Brothers. But the Brothers are the most important. They have the strongest organization, the most effective politically. In very general terms, what do the brothers want? The brothers want to establish something called the Islamic State, and this Islamic State is something, by the way, it's very novel. It's not there in the history of Islamic theology or Islamic law. This term Islamic State or Dawla Islamiyya, it's not there. You will not find it in books of Islamic law or theology. It's a very novel, modern conception. And I believe here the founders of the brothers were influenced by the French Jacobinist modernism, the idea of the strong state capable of modernizing and leading the society, educating the society and changing the society. The brothers believed that Muslim societies are backward in nowadays world. Well, that's very obvious. And they believe that the reason behind this is that Muslims are doomed by westernization and secularization. So the answer to to Egyptian revival, Muslim revival, is to re-Islamize the Egyptian life. Not just Egypt, all Muslim countries, on individual basis and communal basis. You must Islamize the individual. He must recapture the Islamic identity and must have an Islamic worldview, see the world from an Islamic point of view. And they believe that Islam is a totalistic system. This means it's inclusive of politics, of culture, of society, of education, of all aspects of life. So the individual aspect of Islamic revivalism is not enough. Communal aspect is very important. Islamic State is an objective in itself because there is an Islamic Sharia, Islamic law, which must be applied by a state. And there must be an Islamic community, which must be guarded by an Islamic state. Okay? And so the question is, what is this Islamic State? Actually, the brothers never really gave an answer to this. The answers were really very vague. They always say, once we come to power and establish it, you will know what is the Islamic State and we'll give you the details of the Islamic State. So practically it means that the Islamic State has been reduced to a state dominated by the Muslim brothers, the group of the Muslim brothers, who became synonymous with not just the Islamic revivalism, but with Islam itself. Okay, and the final objective or final dream is the creation of the Islamic Caliphate, revival of the Islamic Caliphate, which is a form of a transnational Islamic polity, uniting all Muslims worldwide. That's why the Muslim brothers, they love to say Muslim individual, then Muslim family, then Muslim society, then Muslim state, then Muslim Caliphate, then Muslim world. The whole world will be Islamized. Okay, that's their objectives. So by definition here, you might have concluded that the Muslim Brotherhood is not really democratic. And they have very theocratic understanding of politics. Their understanding of politics is based on religion, obviously. No matter how liberal they might try to make in terms of interpreting religion, still it's based on theocratic interpretation of politics. And they are kind of discriminating against non-Muslims, Christians, or non-Muslims who live in Muslim countries, and on gender basis, women as well, and other groups. They have no problems with procedural democracy as such. What do I mean by procedural democracy? Elections. Free, fair elections as a method of transfer of political power, division of checks and balances, division of government into different branches, and so on. They have no problem with that. But they have problem with the objective or substance of democracy. If you mean by democracy, liberal democracy, meaning pluralism, tolerance, equality, no, they have problem with that. If you mean by objective or substantive democracy, if you mean radical democracy, like trade union activity, strikes, sit-in, direct participation, mobilization in the streets, they also have problem with that because they prefer a strong state in control over society. So actually, in practical terms, they have no problem with the old state in structure. But the only thing that the groups of elites who control the old states, they are not really the good elites. So they only need a turnover, a replacement. They themselves, as the Islamist elites, replace the elites controlling the old state, but the old state will function as it is. For them, that's the political objective of the brothers. And as you might have realized, that these two actors, the old state and the Islamists, were the strongest in Egypt. The old state, obviously, they have the state power. The Islamists were strong because over time they managed to build a very strong organization. I'll come to the point of the organization later, and to mobilize social capital. Social capital, that's a term made by Bob Putnam, the American political scientist, basically means the networks of popular trust. People trusting them, they think highly of them, they trust them at the local level, at the vernacular level. So they have a lot of social capital, cultural capital, a lot of popularity. And this is explainable because under Mubarak, as we said, no politics. There is the only space, relatively speaking, left for free popular action is religion. That's the only space, relatively speaking, free for popular activism, and this explains that Islamists managed to build strong following. Okay? And they also built strong organization. And especially in the last 30 years, the brothers became a sect. And when I say a sect, I mean it. Because it's not like the brother, it's very wrong if you assume the brothers to be, as I was just telling our friend Sergio here yesterday, that usually the Western analysts, they fall into this mistake. They compare the Muslim brother, they assume the Muslim brothers can be the Islamic version of the Christian democratic parties in Europe. You only need to give them the chance to be incorporated within the democratic system, and they will democratize their ideology, their organization, and then they will be moderate and democratic and so on. They will but just be conservative actors, same like the Christian democratic parties in Europe. I'm afraid that's not true. And I'm afraid the Western analysts, they make this analysis based on very limited research. They come to Egypt and they speak to the people, the brothers, members who are fluent in English or French or graduated from foreign schools or foreign universities, and they know well how to speak in language which is very understandable to the Western audience. They can speak in terms of, oh yeah, Muslim brother is compatible with democracy, with human rights, etc., etc. But this is not really representative of the grassroots. The grassroots has their own world, which is very much different from that. So that's a mistake in analysis here. And the organization has been built in the last 30 years to be a real sect. The Brotherhood has about 500,000 people. But this 500,000 people, they work with each other. They work within the same business. They all work in the private sector. Some of them work as teachers in the public bureaucracy. So they work together. They marry with each other. They make families with each other. They relate to each other. So they really become one big family, social group. So this explains the kind of solidarity they have. Okay? And if you add this, so it's strong organization. No matter how we repress them, they always have a hard core to fall back on it. And this explains their perseverance under Abdel Nasser, under Sadat, under Mubarak, and now when they're facing the current crackdown that the regime is inflicting on them. Okay? And still, this 500,000 organization, it can mobilize 5 million votes, at least, in elections, because they managed to reach out to wider audience based on welfare services, and as I said, the trust, people trusting them and trusting their reputation. So the revolution took place in Egypt in 2011, January 2011, and I said from the very beginning it was an exposition of the failure of the old state. And you didn't really have any political oppositional movement which has clear dreams of or a clear construct of the new state that it wants to create. Everyone, the democratic forces, well, we didn't talk about the democratic forces. Democratic forces, they are the only forces who appreciate what I'm saying, that you need to establish new politics, etc., etc., but they lack everything else. They lack organization, they lack money, they lack leadership, they lack discourse, they lack human resources. So they're very good at protest. They're very good at highlighting the failures and bankruptcies of the old world, but only at that. They're not good at anything else. And so, obviously, when the protests took place in January 2011, the people who benefited from it were the more organized ones, the stronger ones. And here I'm talking again about the old state and the Islams. And each one of them has a different objective. The old state, it was clear for them that, and the military here appears as the hardcore here. The old state was, they were, for them, they understood that the people are angry at Mubarak, so Mubarak must go. But Mubarak must go in order to save the regime. Not like, it's very different. Like the democratic forces, they want Mubarak to go in order to create a new system. But no, the old state, they agree that Mubarak must go, but in order to preserve the regime, to reproduce the regime. So the military, they seized on the opportunity to get rid of Mubarak and to get rid of his son, Because in the last 10 years of Mubarak, there was his son, Gamal, had a dream of becoming his successor, the successor to his father. And the military was unhappy with this because Gamal was civilian, was not a military officer. And the military believed that this disrupts the bureaucratic the rule of the bureaucratic seniority rule in the old Egyptian state, and they believe that the military must rule. And Gamal is just a young kid, and he's American educated, and understands nothing about Egypt. He's not part of the Egyptian old state, and he's not a military, so they hated him. And so the January uprising, it gave them the opportunity to get rid of Gamal and to get rid of his father as well, because that's necessary to preserve the whole state, okay? And instead, reproduce the old system in new shape. As the saying says, old wine in new bottles. That was the purpose of the old state. The Islams, Muslim Brotherhood are not revolutionaries by any means. They are reformists at best, conservatives at worst. And for them, it was a golden opportunity to win recognition, legitimacy, and possibly to have a foothold in a newly created political sphere that will pave the way for possible infiltration of the state, and in order to realize their dream of the Islamic State in the long, long run. So that was the objective of the Brotherhood. And the two of them, they managed to, the Brotherhood, the Islams, and the old state, they made an alliance with each other after the revolution in order to, they found common interests here. So after the revolution in Egypt, you had two types of politics emerging: electoral politics and protest politics. The electoral politics was conservative, and from day number one, it was made in order to reproduce the old system. And the two main actors were the old state and the Islams. And you have protest politics, mainly including the democratic forces, the young people, the urban lumpen proletariat, the working class, etc., who believe that elections and what's going on in the electoral sphere will not do them any good because they are weak and as political parties, and because the Islamists and the old state will do their own, they will dominate the electoral sphere. So let's keep doing protests and demonstrations and so on. Okay? What about the common people? The common people are twist voters. They twist their opinions. At the beginning, they were happy with the protests, but over time, they came to they shifted to the side of the electoral politics of the Islamists and the old state, because they believe that this will bring political stability, and we had our enough with the instability and protest politics. So this explains why the Islamists and the old state were very good bedfellows between 2011 till 2013, and in this way the Brotherhood managed to win the parliamentary elections in 2011. They got 45% of the vote, but if you add the other Islamist votes, including the Salafists, Islamists altogether, they got 70% of the vote, which is huge, of course. And in the presidential elections, they won. President Mohamed Morsi, he managed to win the presidential elections in 2002. The old state till that moment had no real problem with the brothers, as long as the brothers respect the rules of the game. Rules of the game is you need to respect the interests of the old state institutions, military, police, judiciary, and so on. Don't touch it. Keep it as it is. Make a constitution which is satisfy these interests, and be reasonable enough in order to provide for political stability. These were the rules of the game. What happened after that? Someone might ask. So what happened after that? Why the old state and the brothers, they became bitter enemies after that? Because the brothers did not respect the rules of the game. And because the popular opinion shifted against the brothers. These two things. So number one, how did the brothers did not respect the rules of the game? At the beginning, the brothers made the constitution which the military wanted. If you look over the constitution that was written in 2012 by the brothers dominated Constituent Assembly, this constitution made the military a state within the state. Military budget is not subject to any kind of oversight or auditing, and the military is responsible for its and as I said, in Egypt, the military is a state of its own. It has its own financial reserves, its own economic empire. Like, they're not doing military activity. They're not manufacturing jets or tanks. No, they are manufacturing consumer goods. Okay, touristic projects, public land, real estate, construction, as if they are a business group. Okay, and it's huge. and huge financial reserves. So it's going to be immune from any parliamentary oversight, and military courts were justified, constitutionalized in the constitution, and a council was created called the National Defense Council, and this council which has a majority members of the military people, and it has the veto over war and peace decisions and national security decisions. So that's what the military wanted, and also the judiciary and so on, they got there what they wanted in the constitution. That's the beginning. But over time, the brothers, they started to get crazy. Like, they started doing things which the military didn't really want. So, for example, the brothers became greedy, to infiltrate the old state institution in a fast pace, to push their men within the bureaucracy, the judiciary, okay, and the police, in a way which was alarming to the old state. Especially that at the end of the day, although they were partners, but the relationship from the very beginning, it was understood to be an uneasy relationship. Why? Because they are different. At the end of the day, the Muslim Brotherhood has an Islamic ideology. Ideology factor is important here. And it's a closed sect, as I said. So the two groups, the military, the intelligence and police on one hand, and the Egyptian state and the Muslim Brothers on the other hand, have very different conceptions about, let's say, national security, national interests, different worldview. And the old state has a very long historical legacy of anti-Islamism, anti-political Islam, not anti-Islam, because the old state uses Islam to justify its politics as well, but anti-political Islam, anti-brothers, okay? So they have a long legacy of enmity. So all of this creates a climate of suspicion between the two sides. And so, to give an example, the brothers started to target the judiciary. The judiciary in specific, after the revolution, they intervened in politics, making many court sentences, which, for example, dissolved the parliament, changed the electoral laws, and the brothers were unhappy with that. And they believe that the judiciary has a lot of anti-Islamist elements. So the brothers, through their president, Mohammed Morsi, and through their parliament, brother-dominated parliament, they proposed a new bill, a new law called the Judicial Reform Law. And this law, it lowered the retirement age to 60. This means practically you are forcing 1/3 of the judges to retirement. And they said they are to be replaced by the people elected by the General Assemblies of the Egyptian lawyers, who are members of the General Assembly of the Egyptian courts. It's not mistaken to conclude here that all of these lawyers who will be elected are brothers, because the brothers have a strong lawyers component. Okay, so it became very clear that the brothers want to infiltrate the judiciary or Islamize the judiciary. So this caused an uproar among the judiciary. This is an example of how the brothers became greedy and they want to intrude into the old state sphere, which was very alarming to the old state. However, the old state would have never got the guts to act against the brothers, make a coup against the brothers, if not the popular opinion had not shifted against the brothers. That's the second development that took place against the brothers. The popular opinion shifted against the brothers in a very fast way. The Islamists in total, they got 70% of the vote 2011, right? And then they stayed for a few months in the parliament. Their performance in the parliament was miserable, to say the least. And as a result, popularity dwindled. So if you look over the results of the vote the Islamist president got in the presidential elections, only 6 months after the parliamentary elections, Mohammed Morsi, in the first round, he got only 24% of the vote. And in the second round, he narrowly won. He won with 51% of the vote. Barely won the elections. So the popularity dwindled very quickly in 6 months. And when Morsi was elected, popularity even declined even more and more. Why? Thanks to a lot of reasons. Number one, the continuation of the bad economic conditions, the bad standard of living. Egypt has a problem of blackout, problems of electricity, energy, and so on. Of course, it's unfair to blame the brothers for it, but that's life. People will blame the president for it. And also the way the brothers acted, their discourse was it had a lot of hate speech, sectarian speech. They didn't do violence themselves, but they tolerated the violent groups. or the retrograde reaction extremist Salafist or jihadist groups. And they were extremely using hate speech against Copts. Like, for example, whenever you have demonstrations and against the brothers in the streets, the brothers will say, these are nobodies. These are the Christians and the old regime members or the followers. So that's this kind of hate speech against the Copts. And also the brothers at the end of the day was a secret group, closed group. It's not transparent group. Up till now, no one really knows what is the brothers. I mean, it's not transparent. We don't know anything about the organization of the brothers. It's just enlightened guess. Okay? We don't know anything about the funds, the money of the brothers. Like the annual budget of the brothers, for example, $2 billion annually. Where does this money come from? Where does it go? And they have a lot of regional extensions. They have a lot of branches all over the Muslim world and extensions all over and connections to important forces in the US or in Europe, in Turkey, in the Gulf and others. So the common Egyptians started to say, we have elected Mohammed Morsi, the guy, but it looks that Mohammed Morsi is not ruling. It's ruling these guys, these people who are named the Muslim Brotherhood group, who looks like a mafia group, who we know nothing about. It's a secretive group and they're controlling the country for their own interests. And they use hate speech, and they are leading the country towards a disaster. So that's a popular impression among white segment of the population. Actually, this created a very bad reaction among the brothers. How did the brothers react to that? The brothers reacted to that by becoming even more Islamist. Because now, as they are losing their base of support among the swing voter, the brothers got 17 million votes in parliamentary elections. Okay? I would say the hardcore brothers' vote of this 17 million is no more than 5 million. The other 12 million is the common Egyptians who voted for them because these brothers, they looked that they have strong organization, strong institution, they look respectable, they look reasonable, they can be trusted. Back then, that was the impression. So the brothers right now, they lost these votes. They lost this support. So the only way for them to retain their strength is to fall back on the Islamist, purely Islamist ideological base of support. So trying to win the support of the Salafists, for example. And Salafists in Egypt are huge. We have like 7 million Salafist vote who voted for the Salafist party in the 2011 election. Okay? So so the only way for the brothers to remain strong in the political street was to fall back on the Islamist purely ideological bloc, which even made the common Egyptians even angrier. It makes it's like self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay? So the country became divided, polarized into two halves. And it was very clear on November 2011 when Morsi made his famous presidential decrees. He made some presidential decrees saying completely suspending. He declared himself and the Muslim Brotherhood Parliament and the Constituent Writing Assembly, which was responsible for drafting the constitution back then. He said that will not be dissolved by any court sentence, and he gave himself unlimited powers, dictatorial powers. These decrees, it was supported by the Islamists, of course, but it created very harsh reaction among the opposition. And you had demonstrations and counter-demonstrations. And the country became polarized and divided into two halves. Each half mobilizing against the other half. And the country went into chaos and civil confrontation, strife for a few months between November 2012 till June 2013. Still, the brothers could have done something to restore stability. They could have given concessions. What types of concessions? The constitution, it was a big issue because they insisted on writing down the constitution the way they wanted. So they marginalized the opposition. So they could have included the opposition while writing down the constitution. They did not do that. They could have made the constitution less Islamic than it became. They did not do that. They yielded to the pressure of the Salafists, and so they made the constitution Islam's, the 2012 constitution. Okay? They could have changed the cabinet, which was extremely weak and ineffective. They didn't do that. Okay? A lot of concessions could have been done, and they said that no. And this could be explained in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, which is a zero-sum game. Either you win everything or you lose everything. It's apocalyptic mindset. That's why there was a joke in Egypt that everyone, the whole world, was interested in saving the brothers except the brothers themselves. Like the EU, the United States, all of them sent mediators and interlocutors who came to Egypt before the coup, before the demonstration, trying to convince the brothers, okay guys, what you're doing is completely crazy. You're going, and you will pay for it, and you must give something. You must give some kind of concession. And if the earlier you do it, the better it is. But the brother insisted on not giving anything, and they insisted that the opposition is big zeros and they are not really, they don't count, and everything is under control. So the opposition organized demonstrations on June 30th. And based on my insider information within the army or military intelligence, the army made 3 scenarios. They said, if the demonstrations are small in numbers, then the military will side with the president. Okay? And they will, they will side with the president. If the demonstrations are larger in number, but still not large enough, then the military will remain neutral, will not side with any side, and they expect that the brothers will attack the demonstrators, and there will be a fight between the two sides, and they expect that this fight will continue for some days or maybe weeks, and they expect the brothers to win over the fight because they are more organized, and then after that the military will intervene to pressurize the brothers to give some concessions in order to make a compromise. That's the second scenario. Third scenario, which what really happened, is the demonstrations were really big, very much big, too big. Okay, and that's what happened on June 30th. And in this case, the military will intervene to make a coup. And that's what happened. Actually, the demonstration on June 30th were asking for early presidential elections. Still, the brothers, that's the final concession that brothers could have given to save their face. If Morsi agreed to early presidential elections, then the military coup would not have taken place. But the brother insisted that they were not going to make any military coup, and Morsi compared himself to Allende of Chile. He said that I'm going to protect and fight for my legitimacy till on my dead body. And so the military made a coup on July 3rd, and they came to power. After that, the military tried to accommodate the brothers to be part of the system and to accept the new rules of the military. Now the military said, okay, the last 2 years and a half, the first phase of, I call it the first round of the counter-revolution, it failed. So now the military will create a new round of the counter-revolution with new terms. The new terms, basically, it minimized the brothers to the status of the junior partner. There will be red lines that the brothers should not transgress. The military should have a veto over the key issues: national identity, national security, national interests. The brothers are not allowed to dominate or be hegemonic. Of course, the brothers did not accept that, and they decided to fight back. Protest, demonstration, situation escalated till the famous massacre in Rabaa El Adawiya in August 14th, and since then it became really a mini civil war between the two sides. And I think estimates of victims right now, more than 3,000 dead and 30,000 arrests and detention, and a lot of other police crackdown on the brothers. A real violent confrontation between the two sides. And terrorism in Sinai, which is another story. Maybe you can expand on it in the Q&A. So what's the situation right now in Egypt? It's a Bonapartism in the making. The military strongman, General Abdel Fattah Sisi, he emerged as the Egyptian Bonaparte, Egyptian dictator, who will come to, like, you have different groups in Egypt. Well, he will come to recreate a strong state in Egypt, unify different factions, business groups, bureaucracy, upper class, upper middle class, middle classes, and unifying them with the specter of, against the specter of terrorism or violence. Okay, and this system will not be democratic by any means. I mean, if anyone thinks that when our friend, this general, when he finishes off with the brothers, if he ever finishes off with the brothers, and then he will establish democracy after that, if anyone thinks like that, then he is naive, or dishonest, or stupid. Why? Because it's very obvious right now. The type of the new constitution that was created, it even gave the military more privileges than the ones in 2012. It strengthened the very important characteristic of the new constitution. Remember the Taifa state. It made it official. and formal. For example, the judiciary is not accountable to anyone any longer. No oversight over the judiciary. Police has its own. It's now codified in the constitution. Okay, and more important than that, the media, the public sphere. Egyptians enjoyed for 2 years and a half enormous, unprecedented degrees of political freedoms, political mobilization, political engagement, demonstrations, strikes, political political parties. All of this came to an end right now. Media right now is a place for McCarthyism, witch hunt, not just against Islamists, but against any opposition figure. I myself, give you an example of myself, I used to appear a lot on TV in the 2 years and a half before the coup, but since the coup, the last time I appeared, I had a fight with one of the military regime support. He's an ex-general who fought with me. He wanted to beat me on live, on air, because I was just saying that the military should be held responsible and accountable for the crimes, that the human rights violation that they did. And that's just an example. I mean, all of the anyone who is different from the regime, anyone who belongs to the opposition who believes that what's going on is wrong, is to be banned from the media. Political parties' activities are restricted. It was very clear in the referendum in the constitution. I don't know if you have followed the result or not. The result was a 98% yes. And these figures have disappeared from the history of humanity. Now you only find them in North Korea, with all respect to North Korea, but you only find them there. Okay? And actually, the military says that this vote has not been rigged, which is true. I agree. The vote is not rigged. But actually, this makes things worse, because this means that the opposition has been very intimidated, discouraged, that they were not encouraged to go to vote. So they boycotted the referendum. No campaign was repressed, was suppressed by police, arrested. Their crimes that they were distributing leaflets for saying no. Okay? Anyone who appears on TV not allowed to say no, and so on. And demonized. Character assassination of opposition. And now it became crazy. I mean, right? I was just telling Sergio today, like the official Egyptian Attorney General, the judiciary, they are bringing dolls on charges of espionage, cartoon characters, comics characters. They are arresting pigeons and doves and birds, as they think that they have some espionage devices. Okay, my professor at AUC, one of my professors at AUC, has been arrested. Well, he's charged with espionage as well. Well, definitely he's not. I know him as well. He's not really a spy. And you have a lot of these cases, and you have 30,000 arrest warrants issued by the Attorney General in the last 30 years. 6 months. That's a record in the history of Egypt. 31 arrest warrants issued against not just Islams, opposition, including all of the opposition, in 6 months. And that's even worse than under Mubarak. Why? Because under Mubarak used to repress his people, the opposition, using emergency law, military courts, which at the end of the day remains exceptional. So you always have the hope that these things are, by definition, illegitimate and exceptional, and there is our respectable judiciary that can bring justice. So you dream that one day the emergency law will be cancelled, the military courts will be cancelled, and then our normal courts, the judiciary, will bring justice to us. Now it's worse. Now the normal judiciary is the one which is repressing the opposition, manipulating laws for political reasons. It's completely politicized. Completely politicized. So this means that there is no official institution of justice in Egypt. End of story. It's not just. This means that there is not just no democracy, no state in Egypt in this sense. Election. Well, there is coming right now presidential elections in Egypt. Most probably Sisi officially did not nominate himself yet, but most probably he will nominate himself for the elections. It's foregone conclusion he will win. Why he will win? For two reasons. Number one, well, he's popular. Many segments of the population really, as he said, they believe that he is the only alternative available to rescue the country from disintegration. The other reason, which is no less important, bias. The state institutions are biased to him. The military council, they made an official statement saying that we support the guy. So the military acts like a political party right now. The media, public and private. Public owned by the state supporting him, the private owned by businessmen, the business class, the oligarchy class made their decision, throw their weight behind Sisi as well. Okay, and as it happened in the referendum, this as I was telling Sergio today, it happened like rigging the vote is vulgar. It's too vulgar. It's outdated. It's old-fashioned. Now you have a new fashion, which copying what happens in Iran. I don't know if you follow the politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Usually in Iran, the vote is not rigged. But the government controls the process from the beginning, from the start. Through screening candidates, disqualifying bad candidates, and controlling the whole process from the beginning. That's most likely that will happen, is happening in Egypt right now. It already started in last January and is going on right now. In addition of character assassination against anyone who participated in the January uprising 2011, they are called agents, conspirators, foreign agents, and agents of the US CIA and the KGB and all sorts of foreign intelligence services, and fifth column of the foreign forces. So that's the features of the Bonapartism in Egypt. Does it have a chance to succeed? Well, again, yes and no. And we have 4 scenarios here. I'll finish with that. The 4 scenarios here. The first scenario is their success. And when I say success, I mean success politically and economically. Politically, suppressing all sorts of opposition and forcing people into silence, and the economic success, providing economic solutions to the economic problems in Egypt. So that's the fascist scenario, the perfect fascist scenario, and then in this case he will become a fascist takeover. I think this scenario is unlikely because he lacks the resources. There are 2 main key points here: the economy and the state. The economy, the Egyptian economic problem is really acute. It's a structural problem. The structural budget deficit right now is huge. Okay, simply you spend much more than you earn, and your revenues are totally based on a rent. And the problem is you need to reduce your expenditure. That's politically dangerous. Why? Because most of the expenditure goes to 2 items. Number 1, wages to the public sector. If you cut down the wages, 2 classes will be unhappy with you. By the way, the Egyptian bureaucracy is one of the largest bureaucracy in the world. 7 million employees out of 80 million. That's a total population. That's a huge proportion, a huge percentage. So if you cut down the wages of these 7 million employees, these employees are 2 types: lower classes and upper classes. The lower classes, they survive on that. So if you cut down, if you force them into retirement, if you privatize, for example, they will be upset with you and they will take to the streets. Okay, the upper classes, the top bureaucracy, they make a lot of money based on their positions, and they will be unhappy with you if you try to cut down their financial provisions, including the military, by the way. The military is one of these institutions which gain a lot of money. So it will be hard for a Sisi, our Bonaparte, to work against the lower classes in the public sector, because they will turn against him, or work against the upper classes in the bureaucracy, because the military is one of them, and he represents the military here. So he will not act against himself. So that's the wages. Subsidies. It's the 2nd largest expenditure item, and the subsidy is extremely politically dangerous. And actually, subsidies for the basic services, food, fuel, basic goods and commodities for poor. Again, Egyptian rulers, they learned the lesson. President Sadat in 1977, he cut down the subsidies. Prices of goods increased in 10-folds. The following day, there were riots. People took to the streets. So the governments learned the lesson. We should not cut the subsidies, otherwise it will be politically disastrous. And no less importantly, a lot of the subsidies goes to finance fuel, oil. Oil is subsidized in Egypt. I mean, we pay, I think, the 1/10 of its universal price. Not just for cars, but for capital-intensive factories, like steel factories and cement factories. And these factories use the subsidized fuel to get huge, unbelievable profit margins. This is the backbone of the business class. And they will be unhappy with the reduction of the subsidies because it will reduce their profit margins. So can you deal with this? It's a huge question. It's a huge problem. And economically, up till now, the regime survives because of the political rent which comes from the Gulf countries. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and United Arab Emirates. United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, they gave to Egypt $21 billion in 6 months. If they hadn't given this money to Egypt, or if they decided tomorrow to cut down or to freeze this aid, the country will starve. Because we have huge budget deficit and you don't have financial reserves, foreign reserves. So this money is used to spend on financing the fuel, and because Egypt is a net importer of oil. So if you don't have the cash, you cannot really import the oil, and if you don't have the oil, then you'll have blackouts, the production will stop, and then you will have a total breakdown of the economy. So the foreign aid here is key, and the foreign aid is fluctuating, so we cannot really guarantee it for sure. That's the first scenario. The second scenario is Sisi will dominate but not be hegemonic. I mean, there will be a space for resistance, a space for opposition to mobilize itself and to try to create alternatives and to protect its position in the public sphere. The public sphere created by the revolution will remain small, limited, besieged, but it will remain. And it will be left to the energies and the ability of the opposition to try to widen it. And I think that's the most likely scenario. The third scenario is democratization by the hand of the military. Like the Sisi will democratize. And I think that's very unlikely because the military will never democratize. Well, that's in general, but I mean in Egypt, because democracy in Egypt means transparency and accountability. And if you have transparency and accountability, the military will kiss their economic interests goodbye. So that's a key issue here, strategic issue to the military. The fourth scenario is national disintegration. Failure. The economy will fail, which is possible. And in this case, the military, remember the Sisi did something very strange. It's the first time in the history of Egypt that the military says we are backing a candidate in a competitive multi-candidate elections. This was never the case before. All the military presidents before that, they came to power not through elections. And the last election, Morsi and Shafiq, in 2012, the military did not remain neutral. Now the military supports one candidate. So what if the candidate came to power and then failed, which is very possible? Then the people will blame and hold the military responsible for it. And this will open the door for national disintegration and a real civil war. I think this scenario is unlikely because people will not be willing to revolt against the military, or the military will not be disintegrated because of the lack of alternatives. And because people know that the only alternative is the Islamists, and the Islamists are, they have already tried the Islamists and they've proven to be disappointing. Well, there are two other scenarios. The fifth scenario is the Islamists come back. And that's the Islamist scenario. The brothers are betting on this right now, that they will keep delegitimizing the system, protesting, till the popular opinion shift against the regime because of economic failures and political mismanagement. And in this case, the Islamists can come back to power, whether through elections or through revolution. And I think this scenario is not really likely because the critical mass of the Egyptian population shifted against the brothers, especially in the urban areas. Like the big cities in Egypt, Cairo, Alexandria, all of these areas become extremely anti-Islamist. So in this case, the Islamists don't really have good chance. The Islamists have a chance of survival. They can remain good, strong, important political actors, but not as ruling or dominant as they want to be. And the last scenario is the promising scenario, which is that the military will fail because of the economy, and then there will be democratic movements created to fill in the alternative and create the new state that I've been talking about at the beginning. And I think this scenario, well, it's very promising, but I think up till now it doesn't really have good chance of success for the simple reason there are no real democratic movements, and they have miles to go in order to create their own institutions. They have a lot of structural problems that we can expand talking about it in the Q&A. Thank you.